Hi, this is Mike Young with Noble Warriors. You're about
really
to hear
want
a
you to think
seminar
the debate's
titled Darwin versus
that
Design.
you're the only
Is
moron left
Intelligent
out
Design
there
and
that doesn't
Intelligent
believe in
Decision?
evolution.
Presented by
I've heard this a
Joe
lot,
Thompson, a team member
but it's
from Noble
far
Warriors
from the
in
truth.
Midlothian, Virginia.
Here's
This
an
challenge
article
was
from the
presented at the
Washington
Iron Sharpens
Times
Iron Men's
that
Conference
says,
in
the headline says,
Fredericksburg, Virginia on
55%
March
of US
19,
naturalist
2011.
scientists believe in
My
Darwinian
prayer
evolution.
is that this message will
What
encourage
does
you
that
in
really
your walk
say?
with Christ and better
45%
equip
of them
you
don't
to lead
believe
your
it. Now,
family.
these are the guys who are supposed to be the experts on evolution. Half of them don't believe it. If I put 10 of them in this room and said, you guys that believe in evolution go over there, and you guys that don't believe it go over there, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, right? So here's a report from Science Digest. Scientists who utterly reject evolution may be one of our fastest growing controversial minorities. Many of these scientists supporting this position hold very impressive credentials. Now, I don't know about you, I like Dilbert. He seems to hit things right on the head for me more times than not. This is a pointy-haired boss says, wow, you have 3 master's degree and a PhD. Yes, it's all very impressive, but interestingly, I have no common sense whatsoever. Pointy-haired boss says, that's not the sort of thing I think you should say in an interview. He says, I don't even see why not. He's not even aware enough of why that shouldn't be said in an interview. Now, I worked with Abbott Laboratories International Operation. We had 7,000 engineers and scientists in our company. Brilliant people. I mean, these guys are inventing new drugs, doing all kinds of stuff. They can be very brilliant at times, and in many ways, they really don't have a clue. And I think what you see, and you're going to see that some out there. What I want you to know today is the truth, okay? So we'll be looking for truth today. You don't have to be a PhD to understand this evidence either. So what is truth? I think some people today would tell you that truth is in the eyes of the beholder. But I beg to differ, I guess, with that, and I believe that the whole beholder has nothing to do with it. The reality is truth is not up for debate. Truth is true and always will be, like it or not. We have no input to it and no control over it and never will. Now let me give you an example of what I would say there. If I were to hand you this object and ask you to tell me, what is that? It's an apple. Why do you think that's an apple? Anything that has that shape, that color, that contour, context, that smell, we call that a banana, right? This may seem to be something very often. It's so silly that we take that for granted, that we just think that that's silly. And I think the point to that really is that's God, right? What if you were to open that banana up? What would you expect to find? A potato or maybe an orange? No, you expect to find a banana because you've grown to trust that anything with that shape, color, size, texture, smell is a banana. That's God's truth, guys. God doesn't jerk us around. He doesn't have gravity on some days and not on others, right? He doesn't have photosynthesis work on some days and then not on others, right? We can count on God time in, time out, time after time, all right? So the ultimate source of truth is God himself. He will deliver even when you don't think he will, when you don't want him to, and here's the real kicker, even if you don't think he does, all right? Ignoring the truth doesn't make it any less true. So we can use this quality of God about truth and his attribute to show the error of the evolutionist way. What does the Bible say the reason Jesus came into the world? To testify to the truth. In John 18:37, Jesus said, "For this reason I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth." Have you ever stopped and think about how Jesus talked? Jesus started many of his sentences with, "I tell you the truth," right? Over 100 times in the Gospels. Do you think he was trying to get something through to us? Do we get his message? But who said this? How does man look at this? If you tell a lie long enough, loud enough, and often enough, the people will believe it. Who said that? Adolf Hitler. Hitler also said this: people are more likely to believe a big lie than a little one. And really, you can make this a little easier if you mix in a little bit of truth, of the real truth. People will get so confused trying to figure out what's true, what's not true, what's fact, what's fiction, that they really don't know what to believe. You can get them confused. If you mix in a little truth with some of the lies, you can have them go on for years. So, in Colossians 2, Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. I say this in order that no one may delude you with persuasive argument. So let's look at what the world has to say about who we are and why we're here. Creationists would say, in the beginning, God. The world would say, in the beginning, nothing. Let's see which more logical, more intelligent based on the facts. So let's start at the beginning. But which beginning? Well, evolutionists would say Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution are where we should start. So let's just see what Charles Darwin had to say about the beginning. What's the one thing Charles Darwin did not talk about in his book, The Origin of Life? The origin of life. Now, why? Because he really had no clue. He knew that he had no clue about the origin of life. He just, if you really want to understand how evolution is supposed to work, guys, we got to start at the beginning and how life could form out of nothing. Evolution is a shell game with a problem. And the problem is there is no pea under any of the shells. Most evolutionists think that the evidence for evolution is in someone else's camp. And when I say this, the geologist thinks it's in the chemist camp, the chemist thinks it's in the biologist camp, the biologist thinks it's in the anthropologist in the astronomer, on and on and on and on. We've been told for decades by some very highly acclaimed scientists that evolution is a fact, and it's been taught in our schools for more than 50 years now. Our government officially sanctions this position, and that's why you see it in your school books. The question ought to be, do the facts really support this position? So let's see. Anybody know who this guy is? Carl Sagan. He's one of the many highly acclaimed scientists that we were talking about there. He used to be kind of what we would call the evolution's most famous face. He entertained us by saying that the Earth is millions and billions of years old. That was his statement. So in his book, The Dragons of Eden, Carl says, evolution is a fact amply demonstrated by the fossil record and by contemporary molecular biology. Anybody notice what Carl just did right there? He deferred to somebody else's area of expertise. Carl's is a cosmos guy, right? Why is he talking about somebody else's area? He defers to these guys. Why defer to the anthropology and molecular biology? It's because he knows the evidence isn't in his camp, all right? So let's look and see if Carl's claim is true. Let's start with some of the most recent findings in the world of molecular biology, and that's DNA. Now, Charles Darwin knew nothing about the cell or DNA. It was a complete mystery to him. He thought the cell was like a blob of jello. But he was never trained as a scientist, so you can't be surprised at that. But Carl Sagan was, and he should know better. DNA is the most complex molecule in the universe. Now, we don't have a lot of time to go into the DNA, and I don't really want to bore you with that, but I'll just tell you, if we were to write out all the DNA codes of just one human being and put that down in a book, we would fill enough books to throw it. If we read a book, threw it in the Grand Canyon, filled it another, threw it in the Grand Canyon, we would fill the Grand Canyon before we would run out of DNA code. So the probability of just one DNA arranging itself by chance has been calculated to be 1 chance in 10 to the 119,000th. Now that's a number a little big for me. I can't get my hands around it, but let me give you something by comparison. The entire visible universe is 10 to the 28 inches in diameter. If I were to say feet or miles, it'd be even smaller number than that. So DNA formed by chance, that's just not an intelligent statement. Now, evolutionists are telling us intelligent design hypothesis is not good science. I don't know what I'd call that. Here's a guy, Paul Davies, once described as the best science writer on either side of the Atlantic, says, nobody knows how a mixture of lifeless chemicals spontaneously organize themselves into the first living cell. Professor Yockey is another guy up in Canada, said, since science has not the vaguest idea how life originated on the Earth, it would be honest to admit this to students, to the agencies funding research, and the public. Hey, this guy's at least honest, right? If all we need to get life is to get all the right chemicals together and the right molecules and right proteins and put them in the right order and give them a little jolt, try this. Put a frog in a blender and turn it on. Now, I know this may seem a little gross, but think about it for a moment. If all that's needed for life is to evolve is to have all the proper molecules in the right place at the right time and maybe adding a little energy, why not just put a frog in a blender and turn it on? Everything is there to make a frog, right? What's being postulated here is called spontaneous generation. This is what scientists call spontaneous generation. What's the difference between the frog in the blender and the one hopping around in your backyard? It's called the breath of life, right? Genesis 7 says all creatures have the breath of life in them. Genesis 2 says the Lord formed of the man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. That's what makes life, guys. This is George Wald in his book, The Origin of Life. He said, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are as a result, I believe, in spontaneous generation. Right? He also said, I will not accept that creation philosophy because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. This is blind faith, if I've ever heard of it, guys. I mean, it's worse than that because this guy's supposed to be a scientist. He's not one of those religious zealots out there, right? Is it science or religion? Now, this is a very famous cartoon that floats around in academic circles. If you can't read it, I apologize. It says, I think there should be a more explicit here in step 2 where it says, then a miracle occurs. But this is what every scientist has to postulate. A miracle did occur, and it was God who did it. Genesis 1 says, so God created the great creatures of the sea and every living and moving thing with which the water teems. All right? According to their kinds, every winged bird according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. Isn't this exactly where we're at? Okay? Now, the question comes up often, so does God's Word really address the evolutionary issues? Well, guys, you know it does. Jeremiah 2:27 says, who says to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave me birth? James 3:12 said, can a fig tree, my brethren, produce olives, or a vine produce figs? Neither can salt water produce fresh fruit, or fresh water, I'm sorry. Proverbs 20:12 says, ears that hear and eyes that see, the Lord has made them both. You see, evolution has no answer for the origin of life. The entire theory can't really get going until life already appears. But what happens then? How does it go from an amoeba to me? Evolutionists would like us to believe it's something like this. That evolution takes a nice, slow process. I can't keep things going here. I don't know what the issue is back there. I think I start to see something starting to evolve. Yes, yes. Amazing. All right, we're just having a little fun here. I don't need any cards or emails from you guys telling me that National Geographic said, this guy is the first pioneer. Now, if you believe that this guy is the first pioneer, someone's trying to make a monkey out of you, guys. A conservative estimate suggests that about 50,000 morphological changes are required to change from one species to another. We really only have 2 of them, the first and the last. And we have a problem because we can't find any of the 49,998 of the other ones out there. It is interesting to note, though, that evolutionists never seem to mention that as this monkey is progressing, whoever it is, that there's the problem of the female. She has to evolve at the exact same rate so they can make little monkeys. And if they don't, there's just no species if the females don't advance at the same rate that the other ones are. Now, many have heard of natural selection, or maybe better known as survival of the fittest. Natural selection selects from existing options. It really cannot generate anything new. They cannot add wings, gills, feathers, hands, feet, anything that is not already there to choose from. And actually, evolutionists have actually moved away from this survival of the fittest. They know that doesn't work anymore, and that's called Darwinism. They've moved on to another theory. It's called based more on mutations creating the new species, and that's called neo-Darwinism. But in every example of where they've had mutations happen, the experimentation has shown that the mutations are always weaker and inferior to the original organism, and they never beneficial to the organism either. So, if evolution is true, it seems logical that the more chromosomes an organism has, the further is it evolved. I mean, that's common sense. So since penicillin has 2 chromosomes, it must have evolved first. and then the fruit fly, and then a tomato. Hey, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right. Tomato's not more advanced than a fruit fly. At least a fruit fly moves around. Wait a minute, lettuce is more evolved. A possum, a redwood, and a kidney bean are all the same. That might explain why we got so many dead possums on the road. I'm not sure. Here we are, the human being at 46, tobacco at 48. You're not as smart as that. You're not as evolved as that cigarette you're smoking, buddy. Here we got twins, a dog and a chicken. You got an ash up on top. That old statement, "You're dumb as a stick," maybe that doesn't mean so much anymore. If amphibians evolved before mammals, why do some amphibians have 5 times more DNA than mammals, and amoeba have 1,000 times more DNA? Well, this seems like it's a little bit of a dead end. And in reality, evolutionists are kind of running out of ideas to answer many of these nagging questions. The truth is, DNA has led us places that the evolutionists would rather not go. Here's what the U.S. News and World Report put out lately. It says, virtually all modern men, 99% of them, share a gene with one male ancestor that they've dubbed Y chromosome Adam, going back very recently to one ancestor. So interesting, everyone in the world is descended from a single person who lived around 3,500 years ago. We all have a common ancestor. Really? I would never have guessed that. But essentially, his name was Adam. So, now, the female gene research suggests something very similar. The mitochondrial marker is really a marker for females only, but it says basically what it's shown is that there's a common ancestor in the female line about 300 generations ago, roughly 6,000 years. So at that rate, Eve would have lived about 6,500 years ago, a figure clearly incompatible with current theories on human origins. I don't know that it's clearly incompatible with any theory that I have on where we came from. It seems to be right spot on. It's only incompatible if you believe the evolutionary thing and man evolved 3 million years ago. I don't know. So which timeline is more reasonable based on the scientific evidence, and which one do you believe? Francis Crick is the guy who was a co-discoverer of DNA, and he made this comment. He said, biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now, why would they need to keep reminding themselves that it's designed? Because it looks designed, guys, and it is designed by God. Is this science, or is this one of those brilliant people with a no common sense moment? Carl Sagan's comment, contemporary molecular biology, not true. Not only is it not true or not amply demonstrated in the contemporary molecular biology, it is exactly the opposite of that. So let's see if we can't see. The Bible in Genesis 1 does not say that God gave a couple of babies a bag of seed and told them some tools and go plant them. No, it said that Adam and Eve were fully formed and mature when God created them, and so was the Garden of Eden. And he said it was good. So we need to understand the debate between evolutionists and creationists. And here's a statement again by George Wald. Time is, in fact, the hero of the plot. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. The possible, probable, and the probable, virtually certain. One only has to wait. Time itself performs the miracles. Now, time is the hero for evolutionists. This is the only way evolution will work, and you must understand this elementary fundamental for all of evolution. Anything, essentially anything can happen with enough time. So they got to guard this secret with their life. This what I say, sacred cow, regardless of common sense or anything else. Because without massive amounts of time, billions and billions of years, evolution has no hope. And this is why they will spare no effort to solve this. So what we're really looking at is, how old is the Earth? Well, if we look from an evolutionist standpoint, it would say billions of years old. Actually, 4.6, if you want to get specific, they say 4.56 billion. Now, why scientists do this? It drives me nuts. I'm an engineer, but I can't figure out why they got to be so accurate on something they don't have a clue on. But anyway, let's assume for the sake of discussion that we're sunken treasure hunters, searching for our fortune in gold, and we finally come upon our ship. And we want to know what records we have found. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we look at some of the booty in there, and we've got some coins from 1750 and some from 1710 and some from 1695. Well, when did the boat sink? Well, logically, from the above evidence here, we could only surmise when it did not sink. It could not possibly have sunk before 1750, right? Because I got a coin in there from that time. Now, this may be a little simple-minded sounding, but it's essential that we understand this concept. Because if just one young Earth hypothesis is true, then the Earth cannot be any older than that. Okay? And if you find one to be true, then we should start casting suspicion on all the other stuff that we're being told that we should know here too. Now, textbooks say the Earth is billions of years old, but not always. Okay? In 1770, it was 70,000 years old. In 1905, it was 2 billion. In 1969, it was 3.5 billion. And this is taken from a textbook teaching book for teachers today. It says, stress that the Earth is thought to be at least 4.5 billion years old. Why you have to stress that, I don't know. But the obvious question to me ought to be, what makes you think you got it right this time? Right? Science textbooks are being revised every couple of years with each new discovery. In fact, this has been happening ever since the Gutenberg press was invented. How often do they have to revise what the Bible says? So, where does the theory that the Earth was really old come from? Well, back in the 1830s, a guy named Charles Lyell didn't care much for the biblical explanation for our being and speculated that maybe the Earth was a lot older than the Bible stated. So he used the different layers of rock strata as his hypothesis. I went the wrong way, sorry. The theory goes that the rock layers are millions of years old and were laid down over very, very long periods of time. From this, it was then theorized that the fossils they contain must be millions of years different in age, and that the fossil sorting must represent evolution. And Charles Darwin was a fan of Charles Lyell. So then what they did is they named each one of these rock strata, and you may recognize a couple of them in there just because maybe you saw Jurassic Park or something. And then they assigned each layer a date based on the theory of evolution. Now notice that the layers of the Earth were dated using index fossils, and then the index fossils were dated by guessing their age based on the theory of evolution. This is not really science, nor a valid application of the scientific method. Suggesting a hypothetical age for a fossil based on theory and then telling everyone is an established fact is not only the way to apply the scientific method. But if you quiz a paleontologist about this, many will assure you that their techniques are indeed scientific. They will tell you that they accurately date the fossils using the date of the rock layer in which they found it. Did you notice what just happened? They assigned a date, and then they said, okay, we know what it is because we found a rock or a fossil in that era. This is kind of the logic that the rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks much more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of circular reasoning because circularity is inherent in their way of developing their time scales. Sorry, we're bouncing around here. Thomas Jefferson said way back in 1787, the moment a person forms a theory, his imagination sees in every object only the traits of that theory which favor that theory. This is part of the bias that gets built in without us even knowing about it. And the audience is really never made aware of this bias or these assumptions. And this is one of those key things. What are your assumptions? We are all biased, guys. We can't get away from that. The question is, which bias is the best bias to be biased by? Ian Tattersall, he's the curator for the American Museum. Now, this is basically a paleontologist, says the patterns we perceive are as likely to result from our unconscious mindset as from the evidence itself. Now, Richard Leakey basically admitted as much when he disclosed the tendency of his famous father, Louis Leakey, to arrange fossils in there and alter their criteria to fit the line of human descent. Now, this is how evolutionists want you to think about the geological column so that it fits the evolutionary theory. You can kind of see up here the succession of life, lower forms to higher forms. We've been finding fossils now for 150 years, and some fit that pattern, some don't. But here's kind of how we're supposed to, this is the way it's supposed to go. If I'm buried above a teddy bear, well, it means that I must have descended from a teddy bear. Okay? That's the assumption that the further you go up, the more recent things are. Evolutionists are continually changing the date of things they had dated so precisely before, because later on they find something buried below it that can't be that old. So it happens all the time, and to be honest with you, it's just a bunch of hocus pocus guys, how they get these dating. Now this would be the classic example of the way evolutionists want you to think about the Earth. Layers are laid down, sediment layer after layer after layer. But even here, fossils are found in all the wrong strata. But what would they do with this? Here's a road cut through West Virginia. Now, I used to travel this road all the time, going back and forth to Virginia Tech. Solid rocks don't bend. They break. A kindergartner could tell us that, right? This rock had to still be soft when it was bent into this configuration. And this slide is probably the single greatest evidence against evolutionists' geological column, which is the basis for all their dating, guys. Can you bend rocks like this? Can anything bend rocks like that? These rocks are all different ages. This would not be an intelligent conclusion based on what a kindergartner knows. All these layers had to be soft and malleable at the same time. Obviously, there was some force that acted on these rocks to distort them like this, but they could not have been laid down millions of years apart without solidifying. This is the foundational principle of all evolution, and you must understand this if you're going to understand how evolutionists think, guys. Anybody ever seen one of these? This is a simple little child's toy showing the natural layering effect of any sedimentation in a fluid. Here's another pattern from the same toy, another result. Now, these are the guys that are telling you that these all things are hundreds of millions of years old because of those layers. This happened in a matter of seconds, actually, this layering, guys. So, do you believe them? This is interesting because here's some trees that have crossed multiple eras of rock spanning millions of years. Now, how do these trees get here? They would have to be hundreds of millions of years old to cross the many layers of the geological column. These trees are called polystrate trees. Now, we find these trees all over the place. There's Germany, France, Britain, Nova Scotia, they're all over the world. And it's clear-cut evidence that these layers were not laid down, millions of years apart. In one of these, a fish was buried vertical, so that the nose of the fish was in one era of rock and the tail is in another thousands of year old rock later. And we've got pictures. Here's a 30-foot petrified tree where the top and bottom are in different coal seams dated thousands of years apart. So notice where man is supposed to fit into this picture. Right? What happens when you find fossils that do not fit the predetermined model? And it happens all the time. This is one of those key questions that you need to ask in evolution. It's a very simple question. It said, what do you do with the data that you actually observe that does not match the theory? Most of the time, evolutionists do just that. They just ignore it, right? But notice where the rise of man is supposed to be here, way, way at the top. Now, another one of those most famous mouthpieces for evolutionists is Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins said, if a single well-verified mammal skull were to turn up in 500 million-year-old rocks, our whole theory of evolution would be utterly destroyed. Okay? You said it, I didn't, Richard. This is where humans are supposed to be in the last 100,000 years, basically. Now, this is where we found human artifacts all the way down to 600 million-year-old rock strata. Something's wrong, seriously wrong. All right? 400, 500 million-year-old humans, that doesn't fit with the theory. How can this be? Here is just some of the things that have been found. I know you probably can't read that, but we're talking about skeletons and handprints, footprints, all kinds of things found in rock that are 4 or 500 million years old. Here is a handprint in a crustacean rock that was dated at 110 million years. This thing is so detailed, you can see the fingernail imprints on that fossil. Here's another one we found, a human hand bone in a crustacean rock, again, 100 million years old. Here's a footprint in 100 million year old rock. Now this is interesting. That little ball there is a trilobite. Now the trilobite is supposed to be the earliest known organism on the planet, okay? Yet it's in a sandal print of a human. Not only was man standing up, but he had sandals on at that time. It's just another example where a human footprint should never have been. Here's a hammer in 400 million year old solid rock. Here's a vessel in a silver vessel in solid rock over 600 million years old. We're told that coal and oil takes millions of years for them to form. Here's a cast iron pot found in 1912 in a lump of coal. Here's the bell inside a lump of coal in 1944. The guy still got the bell. In 1996, the Australians got about $22 million to turn oil from sludge in about 30 minutes. Anything. This is turkey guts into light Texas crude. I like what the president of the company said. We duplicate what Mother Nature does, but what Mother Nature took millions of years to do, we do in about 30 minutes. You know, we're told that petrification takes millions of years. Really? Here's a piece of chopped wood that's been petrified. Here's a cowboy leg in a cowboy boot, petrified right there. The cowboy boot had 1950s written on the sole. A petrified pickle. My wife and I went to Carlsbad Cabin on our honeymoon, and they told us 250 million years old. These stalactites grow at about 1/4 of an inch every 1,000 years or so. Really? Anybody been to the Lincoln Memorial? Lincoln Memorial was built in 1922. If you go in the basement, you can find a stalactite in there 50 inches long, and it was only 40 years in the making. There's a teepee fountain in Wyoming. That's the fountain as it looks. That guy's about 6'1". How about erosion? At the current rate of erosion, the continents would erode flat in about 14 million years. How can we have rocks that are 300 times older and still be above the sea level? We've only got a few thousand years of sediment on the ocean floor. What happened to all here, the Mississippi runs about 80,000 tons of sediment an hour out the delta, down around New Orleans. There's only 30,000 years worth of accumulated mud in the delta at most. Here's one of the best examples of erosion is Niagara Falls. I used to live not too far from this where I grew up. But Niagara Falls is like every falls. They erode backward. And if we look at a slide from 1764, you see where the falls was, 1819, 1842. You can see it's eroding back. Well, if the Earth is millions of years old, why is Niagara Falls less than 8 miles long? The Great Lakes and the Niagara Falls that holds the water into the Great Lakes is less than 10,000 years old. The salinity of the ocean is 3.6%. We've gone from freshwater, we could have gone from freshwater to saltwater that it is now in less than 5,000 years. Coral reef. The Great Barrier Reef during World War II off the coast of Australia was hit by a lot of bombs, sunken ships, everything that got torn up. The Australian government did a study out there to see how long it would take to recover. Found out that it's less than 4,200 years old. Trees. The oldest tree in the world is 4,300 years old. Ever wonder why the oldest tree is only 4,300 years old? How about writing languages, the languages? World Book Encyclopedia said the first developed systems of word writing appeared about 5,000 years ago. The oldest languages that can be reasonably reconstructed are already modern, sophisticated, complete from an evolutionary standpoint. Why are the oldest reliable historical written records less than 6,000 years old? Isn't it interesting that the oldest evidence of writing that we can find had a hard start, complete, sophisticated, and modern? Shouldn't we expect it to be slow ramp up as it's evolving, as we're evolving, our communication would? The Chinese calendar was 4,700, or the year 2000 was 4,700 on the Chinese calendar. Maybe they started with the birth of Shem or Noah before the flood. Our year 2000 was 5760 on the Hebrew calendar, and they left 164 years out intentionally to make Daniel 9:25 prophecy point to Simon Bar Kokhba instead of Jesus. The Saxons in England have genealogy going back to Adam. The Danes and the Norwegians lists go back to Noah. Now, you can pick up a book called After the Flood to look at more of that. Here's a headline news from the Minneapolis, Minnesota. It said, last weekend's population topped 6 billion. Well, according to Encyclopedia Britannica again, if the population growth were charted backward in time from the day, even slower than it's going now, the result would be a handful of people alive about 4,500 years ago. Just about the same time Noah's post-world flood would have been. On the other hand, if we reverse that and say a couple of monkeys stood up and called themselves people a million years ago, and they evolved up here, we should have about 10 to the 43 zeros of the number of the population. See, don't you find that at least a little bit interesting, right? That everything that they're telling you, you actually look at it and it doesn't come together very well. But what do you do if you're an evolutionist? If you have this data at hand, what do you do if you're an evolutionist? You create a catastrophe. Scientists are now putting forth a theory that there was a catastrophe 70,000 years ago that reduced the human population back to a few thousand. Now, this catastrophe would make Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens is over here on the right now. We watched Mount St. Helens, most of us. It would make Mount St. Helens look like a pop gun. Anybody here Noah's flood? About that time, that it should be noted really that the Bible says about 6,000 years ago there was a catastrophe, and it was a worldwide flood, and it killed everyone except 8 faithful people that day. Now, why do evolutionists choose to ignore the obvious answer and make up one of their own? The Bible tells us very explicitly what happened and why it happened, so why do they need to make up one that there's no evidence for? That bottleneck, there's a bottleneck. They've got to deal with it. Now, the Bible says it was a flood. Now, it's interesting that there are 270 flood stories around the world. All right? Think about that for a while. Why would that be? This fact alone, nothing to support or anything else, should give us a little reason to pause. All right? Why would so many ancient tribes on different continents with different languages, different cultures and customs all have a similar story about how their ancestors came to be? That's certainly not reasonable, nor statistically plausible. So why do they? Well, it's possible maybe that it's true. Let's take a quick look at some of these. In Hawaii, long after the death of Kinohana, the first man, the world became a wicked, terrible place. There was a good man left. His name was Nu'u. Funny, sounds a little bit like Noah. He made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The water came up over all the earth and killed all the people, and Nu'u and his family were saved. In China, guy named Fu He, considered to be their father of their civilization. The history records that Fu He, his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters, interesting numbers, escaped the Great Flood. He and his family were the only people alive on the earth, and after the Great Flood, they repopulated the world. The Toltec Indians in Mexico, this listed at 1,716 years after the destroyed by the Great Flood, covered the highest mountains. They built a closed chest, like an ark. Languages became confused 520 years after the Great Flood. Now, this is in Tlalpan, and I actually have been to Tlalpan. It was one of the plants that I had in the world. But it's interesting. The first world lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by a giant flood that covered the highest mountains. Only one man survived. His name was Coxcox. The Bible dates put the flood at 1,656 years after creation. The Toltec legend is only 60 years off after 4,000 years. There is archaeological evidence. The flood tablet from Gilgamesh, it's the most famous cuneiform from the Mesopotamian area. Many of you have probably heard about the Gilgamesh. The geological evidence for a flood is pretty significant. Now, we're not going to go through all of these. We'll go through a couple of them. I just wanted you to know there's lots of them out there. Clams open when they die. Now, anybody that's ever walked on a beach knows this, right? There's interesting fact, though, there are stacks and stacks and stacks, tens of feet thick, of unopened clams on mountaintops all over the world. Here's a picture of some of them that they've taken off of things like Himalayas and Mount Everest. Here's an oyster 11.5 feet wide, 2 miles above sea level. How'd they get there? There are massive, massive graveyards all over the world. I mean, they're in North America, Europe, South America, and there are actually fossil fields with almost 1 trillion fossils in them. The question is why? Why is it that all these animals would know where they're supposed to go die, right? This happy hunting ground that we all crawl over here when about to die, and trillions of us are just going to die in the same place. Does that make sense, right? Are we supposed to believe that? Or is a better explanation that if anybody has seen the torrential waters of a flood, they dump everything? The tsunami in Japan that just occurred dumps it all in one spot, right? Now, I think this is how evolutionists want us to think how a fossil forms, right? But in reality, it doesn't happen that way. There's not a spot on the earth where this is where the dinosaur dies, he sinks to the bottom lake, he's covered with some silt, he becomes rock hard, and then later it's eroded away. It just doesn't happen that way, guys. You know that if a deer dies in the wood, doesn't other animals come and pick it and tear its bones and run it all over the place? Right? The only metaphysical geological model that accurately depicts the greatest amount of this observable of fossils is a global flood. Now, some things were buried so rapidly, we got soft flesh details. In this fish, we can see the fins, the eye sockets. A jellyfish has no bones. What are you burying but jelly? And they're fossilized. Here's a compound lens. Here's one caught in the fact eating. Here's one giving birth. They got buried very, very rapidly, guys. And by the way, you guys see all these photos on Evening News and NBC and National Geographic? Probably not, but anyway. The fossils really aren't sorted as well as they would like us to believe. He said, and we're culprit. We creationists are part of the problem here because we have a mistaken notion that the fossil record is a very detailed and orderly progression, and we've gone to great lengths to accommodate this fact in our flood geology. We need to pay attention to this. Now, why are the animal fossils sorted into layers? There's a number of reasons. Habitat, intelligence, mobility, body density. Scientists have demonstrated that they buried a bird, a mammal, a reptile, and an amphibian all in a bunch of muddy water. And during liquefaction, they all sorted into that order. The Grand Canyon, this is what they point to as the classic geologic column and how that would occur. But the Grand Canyon is better evidence for a flood than slow erosion. I don't know if you guys have been out there, but the snow line tells the story. Where does snow fall? In the mountains. Well, the Grand Canyon is right at the top of the Kebab Lift. If you've been there, you notice that the north rim's about 6,900 feet above the sea level, and 88 feet on the south rim. The river enters at 2,800, flows about 270 miles, and comes out at 1,800. Why do we know that the Colorado River didn't cut that gorge? Water doesn't flow uphill. You don't have to be a scientist to understand the evidence, guys. I don't care if you have a PhD or not. My kindergartner kid, when she was in kindergarten, could tell me that, right? So how did it form? If you build a dam right where the Glen Canyon Dam is right now, if there were a dam across there, the water that would be backed up would cover 4 states, roughly the size of the Great Lakes in the Midwest. And if you were to let that go all at one time, you would see some tremendous erosion. Now, do we have any evidence of this? And the answer to that is yes. The Glen Canyon Dam is actually where the Colorado River comes into the Grand Canyon into the state of Arizona. And they built a dam here. And in 1983, they had a huge rain. And you see where they're dumping water out of this lower section here? Well, when they opened the gates there the first time, they heard this tremendous rumble. And that was actually cavitation. And in about 20 seconds, they shut it down. This was the end result, okay? In 20 seconds, it carved about, sorry about that. I don't know why it's bouncing around here. That's about 32-foot deep hole in solid rock and 180 feet long. Mount St. Helens, when all the ash and everything flew and backed up those creeks, it filled it up, and then until all that water starts backing up until it let go, 150 feet, guys, in a matter of seconds, carved into this rock. Not millions or thousands or billions of years. How about radiometric dating? This is an interesting one. Everybody likes, well, I understand a little bit of radiometric dating. You've got to look at the periodic chart and see how close nitrogen, which we got a lot of that in the atmosphere, and carbon are on the periodic table. If we could just knock a proton out of the nucleus, we get carbon-14. And this is kind of how it happens. The solar winds come in, strike the Earth, and we got nitrogen up there, and it just plucks a little bit of a proton out of there. This is how we get carbon-14. Our atmosphere is made up about mostly nitrogen, a little oxygen, and carbon dioxide. And within that oxygen, carbon dioxide are a few carbon-14 molecules. Now, the way this works is during photosynthesis, plants breathe in CO2 and make it part of their tissue. And then animals eat that and make it part of their bodies. And then when a plant or animal dies, it stops taking in this carbon-14 stuff. So whatever C14 is in the body continues to decay, and it's not taking any more in. So we know the half-life of C14 is 5,000 years or so. It goes out of balance. Well, we'll then know that, okay, however much carbon-14 is, we can date by that. That's how it works without getting too complicated. Remember that said about assumptions? What's the assumption here? Well, that the amount of C14 in the atmosphere has always been the same. It's not changing so that we have some place to compare it to, some standard. Well, it's been calculated that it would take 30,000 years for the Earth's atmosphere to reach equilibrium. Well, we know that the Earth is millions of years old. We can just ignore the equilibrium problem, right? It hasn't reached equilibrium yet. Radiocarbon is forming 28 to 37% faster than it's decaying. Well, what does that mean? Well, here's when we measure the age of something like this woolly mammoth. The leg is 15,380 radiocarbon years, while the skin and flesh is 21,000. It's the same animal. This is back in 1949 when the technology is first coming out. Well, we move on. The living mollusk is dated at 2,300 years. This is in 1963. A freshly killed seal was dated at 1,300 years ago. Well, that's 1971. Here's a couple of scientists finally spilled the beans. He said, if C14 date supports our theories, we put it in the main text. If it does not entirely contradict them, it goes in a footnote. If it's completely out of date, we just drop it. Now, completely out of date with what, guys? With a preconceived notion of what it should be, or what? All right? A couple of Russian scientists dated a couple of dinosaur bones at 30,000 years, but that's way off, right? And then a guy in Ohio dated some at 20,000 years. How can that be? How can we get so radically different from what the norm is? We forgot to tell them they were dinosaur bones before they started dating them. Here's what a guy says. No matter how useful it is, though, radiocarbon method is still not capable of yielding accurate and reliable results. Accepted dates are actually selected dates. This whole blessed thing is nothing more than 13th century alchemy, and it all depends on which funny paper you read. So the Earth's magnetic field has also declined 10% in the last 150 years and 40% over the last 1,000 years. Remember, that's what's protecting us and creating C14. Well, it's getting weaker, so it cannot be, just on that fact alone, the Earth can't be more than 25,000 years old max. And carbon dating can't work. Something you want to consider, if the sample is a known age, radioisotope dating doesn't work. But if the sample is an unknown age, well, then it does work. Radiometric dating would not have been feasible if the geologic column had not first been erected. Ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating to the rocks. Aha! We're back to the rocks dating stuff. That's the bottom line, folks. No matter what the technology has brought to bear, this is the final decision maker. The scientific evidence shows that evolutionists are wrong about the age of the Earth. So what is the scientific evidence for evolution? I don't know, guys. I've looked, and I can't find it, all right? So I thought, well, let's try the missing link, all right? The never-ending search for the missing link, pursuing these transitional fossils. Were these amphibians, these fish walking out, were they breathing air or were they breathing something else? That's never been talked about. But here's what Anthony Stanton said in his book. He said, "It is the most misleading phrase because it suggests that only one link is missing. It would be more accurate to say that the greater part of the chain is missing, so much so that the entire is not entirely certain whether there is a chain at all." This is Charles Darwin. He had his own doubts, guys. He said, "The number of intermediate varieties, meaning the missing link, which must have formerly existed on the Earth, must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology sure does not reveal that any of these finely graded organic chains. It is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." So how did he solve that question? Well, he explained it away. He said, well, our record is not very good. The geological record is extremely imperfect, and this fact alone will, to a large extent, explain why we do not find intermediate varieties. All right? So he who rejects the views on the nature of the geological record will rightly reject my whole theory. Okay. He was right. I mean, the geological record, when Darwin was around, was not very good. Okay? It was extremely imperfect, so he's correct, but he thought once we found more records, they would support his theory. So, if I may be dead, but I can still tell you everything you need to know, what can a fossil bone really tell us? Who its children are? No. What its spouse looked like? Well, no. What it ate for lunch? No. When it died? No. Where it died? No. How it died? No. That it's dead? Yes. All right? So if you find a fossil bone in the dirt, you don't know if it had any kids. You don't know if it produced different kinds of kids. All you really know is it's dead. All right? So why would evolutionists claim that bones in the dirt can do something that living animals can't, and that's produce different kinds of themselves? No fossil would ever be counted as evidence in a court of law. Now, so let's look at some of the bones that have been found. Now, Nebraska man and his wife, this was shown in a Illustrated London, 1922. Nebraska man was scientifically built from one tooth. Now, the greatest jigsaw puzzles in the world, I know, can't do that, all right? But you would be amazed at how few actual components, like bones, are available at a site and then are reconstructed using hope, a prayer, and a wish, and whatever else. In fact, all the archaeological evidence that has ever been found would not fill the top of a pool table. So how do they do this? This reconstruction from bones, here's an example of 3 different whale bones that we found, and the actual whales, what they look like, this pre-programming of the soft tissue, right? We really can't tell at all. Look at the bottom whale there, what it should look like and what it really looks like, all right? Now, given a skull, and this is a complete skull, you can see how they reconfigure. This is not bones and all the hyper-technology that you got today out there. But same skull given to 9 different artists comes up with 9 different looking skulls. Now, that's fantasy. I've ever heard it. This is a task that was given to a group of artists from National Geographic. The art department gave 7 incomplete bone sets, and you can see the bones right up there. That's the bones that they gave these artists, and they told them that these candidates were told that the bones were from a female. Now, how they knew that, that's a mystery to me. I don't know how they know it's from a female. They're also told that she is 2 million years old, and evolutionary ancestor man that they were looking for was a realistic hominid. All right? That's not empirical science, guys. That is someone's opinion, and you give that to 9 different people, and you get 9 different recreations of it. So, if we look at the evolutionary Hall of Shame, sadly, evolutionists have a long and sordid past when it comes to providing the truth. The list is long, and it's growing. Now, this is some of the members of the Hall of Shame. We're not going to have time to look at all of them, but I want to let you know there's plenty of them, and it's growing. Ernst Haeckel said the turning point in his life and thinking was when he read Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. Now, you need to know Ernst Haeckel was Darwin's most fervent ally on the European continent in the 19th century. He is famous for what's called Haeckel's embryos. He put together 9 different picture schemes of what different animals, pigs, cats, dogs, humans, etc., look like at different stages in the embryonic development. Well, it was shown to be a fraud within 5 years of him publishing this. Now, this was back in 1874, and it's still in textbooks today. Here's the actual photos of what it looks like on the bottom. He increased some head sizes, decreased others, changed eye details, the posterior length, and some other things. Shown to be a fraud within 5 years of him publishing that. Now, when he's tried in the court, in the university court, here's what he said. A small percent of my embryonic drawings were forgeries. I just filled in a little bit here, there, reconstructed a couple of the missing links to help along. He said, I should feel utterly condemned were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie under the same charges. That's a pretty damning statement for all evolutionists in its time, right? Yet this fraudulent chart is still in your children's textbooks today, guys. You'll find it everywhere. Why? Remember, I'll go back to Nebraska Man? Here's the real Nebraska Man. It was an extinct pig's tooth that someone guessed wrong. Now, here's the headline from the New York Times. In 1912, Darwin's theory is proved correct. How many times has Darwin's theory been proved correct? This was Piltdown Man. Now, what they found for Piltdown Man was a jawbone, 2 molar teeth, a piece of a skull, thought to be about 500,000 years old. And one of the guys who discovered this was actually knighted by the King of England for this monumental discovery. And this made all the papers. This was some of the expert advice that was referred to in the Scopes monkey trial, but there was a problem. It was an intentional fraud. The jaw was actually that of an ape, 50 years old, and the teeth had been filed down and stained to look like they were a little older. Here's Lucy. Now, Lucy was discovered when I was in high school, and I remember them finding Lucy in Africa. Look at the skull bones that were found, and look what they have for Lucy now. I mean, is what her skull is actually supposed to be. How do you get such a detailed skull from so few fragments? Notice also that she has no hands or feet. This is kind of critical because she's supposed to be a transitional from walking on all fours to standing up and going around. Well, here's what that would look like in the St. Louis Zoo today with hands and feet. No hands and feet were found. The purpose of the display is not really for education, but indoctrination. Now, somebody's called him out on this. A professor at the University of Washington in St. Louis said the statue is a complete misrepresentation, and I believe they know it's a misrepresentation, but zoo officials have no plans to knuckle under. I like that they got a sense of humor, at least. We cannot be updating every exhibit based on every new piece of evidence. We look at the overall exhibit and the impression it creates. We think the overall impression this exhibit creates is correct. What they're saying is we really are not interested in facts, right? The whole basis of Lucy is she's supposed to be the transitional thing from walking on all fours to standing up. She didn't have any hands or feet. Now, the discoverer of this, a guy named Johansen, actually disavowed later in his life. He said, she probably was just an ape. And in March 2000, Nature magazine, Lucy's wrists are those of a knuckle walker. Did you guys hear about that? No, that's still in my brain from when I was in high school. The Tolly footprints. The form of the foot was exactly the same as ours. Were it not known to be so old, we would readily conclude that it was a member of our own species. But here's what comes out in the National Geographic, and look at the toe print. Why the separated toe? To make it look a little more ape-like. How about Neanderthal man? We've kind of all heard that. It's a faulty reconstruction based on a guy with hunchback disease and rickets. Is this Neanderthal man? I don't know. Here's a classic example, right? Remember the 9 different artists could come up with 9 different looking skulls? Well, does he fit the bill, or could he fit the bill for one of those? Now, here's some Aborigine, a European, and a Flathead Indian. Notice the ridges on some of them. Chewing has a tendency to change the brow thickness. Tell me you've got something more than a brow thickness to make him the missing link. Now, where would this guy fit into that? We have all kinds of diseases today, guys, that we can't explain. Where would he fit in? We come in all shapes and sizes and colors, and God created us all that way. Not all of these kinds are the kind that the public as a whole imagines to be right and perfect in our eyes, but God loves us all just the same. And the Bible talks about these guys all the time, and they're people who need Jesus. Now, this was actually a fairly recent news article. I remember this was in 2005. I was living in Chicago at the time. One of the foremost experts on Neanderthal men, this guy named Professor Rainer Posch von Seiten, he says he was forced to resign in disgrace. He systematically falsified dates on numerous Stone Age fossils, including a skull fragment dubbed Hoffenhauser's Man. He said the commission finds that Professor Posch, over the last 30 years, he's a widely recognized guy in carbon dating. He says 3,300 years old for a female that he had dated at 21,000 years. Another dating issue where he dated something at 27,400 years was a guy who died in 1750. Now, here's what the response was to this guy. These are other guys talking about it. He says, we're having to rewrite prehistory because of this guy. One guy, we got to write all of our thought and theories about prehistory. Anthropology now has to revise its picture of modern man between 40,000 and 10,000 BC. Here's what the president of the university says. He apologized to the public. He said, a lot of people look the other way. The signs for evolution defrauding the world are all over the place, guys, and when will we wake up and recognize them? I think there's going to be a coming time in the future where we say, how could we have been so blind? But the world is starting to see. Here's one of the things they like to talk about, horse evolution. Horse evolution, it's one of those popular things. This is one of the best examples of evolution. Actually, it was debunked 60 years ago. Here's an Irish textbook, Horse Evolution. And I ask, based on what evidence? These are taken from textbooks today, okay? Well, here's an example that says, here's how it was originally talked about in 1950. The evolution of the horse family can be readily shown to have been unintentionally falsified. This was noted back in 1950 when they discovered that it was not quite right. So the early classical evolutionary tree of the horse was all wrong. This was 1951. They got that straight. And they said it never really happened in nature. It was 1953. We still don't got it straight. Here, the much-repeated gradual evolution of the modern horse has not held up to close examination. Why are we still repeating it? This is 1992. This is a horse evolution display at one of our most prominent universities in the country. This is at Yale University. It was proven wrong over half a century ago. Why is it still there? The failed hypothesis, the reason it's probably still there is the failed hypothesis was a Yale professor's. This was his idea. His claim to fame. Your pet projects and theories die hard, don't they? Well, Adolf Hitler said something else. Let me control the textbook and I will control the people. That's scary, guys. We have discovered more than 1 trillion fossils now, and that's just huge, huge, huge. But in reality, we are now 120 years out after Darwin, and the knowledge of the fossil record has been greatly expanded. We now have 250,000 fossil species, but the situation hasn't changed much. The record is still surprisingly jerky and ironic, and we have even fewer examples of evolutionary transition than we had in Darwin's time. Still no transitional fossils. This is an evolutionist, a paleontologist at the London Museum says, I will lay it on the line, folks. There is not one such transitional fossil for which we could make a watertight argument. Now, I know a lot of people talk about Archaeopteryx. Here's what a guy says. Paleontologists have tried to turn Archaeopteryx into an earthbound feathered dinosaur, but it's not. It's a bird, a perching bird, and no amount of paleobabble is going to change that. The extreme, now this is Stephen Jay Gould. He kind of took over after Carl Sagan as the mouthpiece for evolution. He said, the trade secret of paleontology is the extreme rarity. He says, the evolutionary tree that adorns our textbooks have data at the tips and nodes of their branches only. The rest is inference. Doesn't make any difference how reasonable it is. Here, this guy was, he says, the fossil record cannot be regarded as anything other than hostile witness against evolution. Now, Douglas Dewar was once an ardent evolutionist. He is no longer. So, the fossil record is more a tribute to extinction than to evolution. The theory of evolution is supposed to deliver new and varied species. Where's the evidence of this? Think about that, guys. 99% of all species are now extinct. Now, that's really amazing. But if evolution is true and we are still evolving, where are all the new species? This is one of the most damaging evidence there is against evolutionary theories, right? We need to really ponder this for a while. Evolution is a fact based on a fossil record? Not true either, Carl. But how do evolutionists respond? All right? Well, with another theory. And the new theory is called punctuated equilibrium. It's just a fancy term that literally is supported by the lack of evidence. There's no evidence that that's how the theory works. So you make one that works. Evolution is unproved and unprovable. We believe it only because the only alternative is special creation, and that is unthinkable. Is this science? I think not, guys. Evolution is not a fact. Evolution doesn't even qualify as a theory or a hypothesis. It's a metaphysical research program, and it's not really testable science. This guy, again, was a leader in that field. Well, we'll switch gears a little bit now and say, okay, where do the dinosaurs fit in? We all like the dinosaurs. They're cute. We know. So where do they fit in? Well, we humans are here way at the top of the chain. Dinosaurs kind of came in there 250 to 65 million years ago. I want you to try and keep this in mind as we go along. All right? This is the time frame where humans and dinosaurs are supposed to function. Dinosaur means terrible great lizard. Now, in a book, one of the texts says, like all reptiles, it grows throughout its life. Is it possible that a dinosaur is just a reptile that has been growing for a really, really long time? The Bible tells us of men living over 900 years before the flood. What if animals lived this long also? If they had, wouldn't they have continued to grow the entire time? There is no non-scientific reason why they could not. So, could this guy be a future Triceratops? And how about this guy? The inserts are real. Now, the term dinosaur wasn't even invented until the late 19th century. If you look in a dictionary in 1891, you won't find the term dinosaur. Dinosaurs are mentioned throughout all of history, but the name has been changed. Anybody know what they were called before? Dragons, serpents, leviathan, behemoths, right? I don't know if that's a strategy they got working or not, rename them, and then long ago and far away. Since the term dinosaur was not invented until a couple thousand years after the Bible was written, your translation probably does not list it in your concordance. If you can find an earlier copy of the Bible in the 19th century or older, you will find that dragons are mentioned 34 times. Here is some of the names for it in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Deuteronomy, Exodus. If you were to look up the term dragon in the dictionary, this is what you'd find. Now rare. Isn't that funny that they didn't say it doesn't exist, it's a fantasy, it says now rare? Isn't that interesting? It's the number one answer, by the way. An example of some dinosaurs mentioned in the King James Version. Their wine is the poison of the dragons, in Deuteronomy. In Job 41, out of his mouth, Leviathan, mouth go burning lamps and sparks of fire. Job 40, behold now, behemoth, which I made with thee, eats grass. Now, your translation may say, if you look at some of the later versions, they may call the behemoth something like this, elephant or a hippopotamus. Now, that's ludicrous, and I'll show you why here. This is what they want, some might say this. It says, lo, now, his strength is in his loins, and the force is in the navel of his belly. Well, elephants have a big belly. Granted, hippopotamus have a big belly too. Dinosaurs have a big belly. He's got a big belly. So does he. I wouldn't call him a dinosaur, though. But it also says in Job 40, he moves his tail like a cedar. Okay? Now, I have a friend from Lebanon, and I asked him to send me a picture. Here's the famous cedars of Lebanon that you see in King Solomon building the temple. That he took a picture with his kids, climbed in a tree, just to give you an idea. Well, Is this a cedar tree? Not that either. Now that's more like a cedar tree, right? It also says in Job 40, his bones are like bars of iron. Here's a Bronchiosaurus toe bone. Here's the leg that goes with that toe bone. 20 foot. Now this guy would fit the bill probably a whole lot better talked about in Job 40. It's the largest dinosaur ever found. It's a 60-foot Poseidon. He was found in Oklahoma in 1944. It could grow to be 100 tons. This is the verse we're talking about, right? You know, his power is in the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. His bones are tubes of bronze. First of the ways of God. If a river rages, he's not alarmed. Hey, what's a better fit? An elephant, a hippopotamus, or the Bronchiosaurus or the Poseidon dinosaurs? If your Bible has footnote like this, remember it's the Bible text that is inspired, not the footnotes, guys. National Geographic again. No human being has ever seen a live dinosaur. How does he know that? Was he alive for all the time a human being's alive? He talked to them all? I don't know, but does the evidence support the statement? Well, in 900 AD, an Irish writer wrote, says, an animal with iron nails on its tail. These details match pretty close to a couple dinosaurs we do know aware of, right? There are thousands of legends of people seeing or killing dinosaurs. Dragons, I mean. Alexander the Great reported that when he conquered parts of what is now India in 326 BC, his soldiers were scared of great dragons that lived in caves. Carl Sagan even said the pervasiveness of dragon myths in the following legends of many cultures is probably not by accident. Here is an Egyptian artifact found in a 12th century BC tomb, a long neck, dragging looking kind of guy in there, I don't know. Here is a piece of slate from, it looks like this maybe would be called necking in that day, I don't know. Here is a cylinder wax that you can roll. These is how they used to seal documents and stuff, but it's, notice the dragon-like image with wings in the middle there. Here's a Babylonian seal from around 600 BC. These are the entrance gates to the ancient city of Babylon. Look at the inlaid images on the walls there. I'll give a little close-up here. Here is a U.S. soldier in Iraq. The inlaid walls behind him. Here's a pre-Inca Indian riding a dinosaur. And this is part of the Ica stone collection down in Peru. There's about 11,000 of these stones. I'll give you just a glimpse of some of them. Here's one of the stones. Is that a Tyrannosaurus Rex there? How about Triceratops? A weird thing, though, people couldn't figure out, what are these circle patterns on the skin? Well, they didn't really know until they found a piece of unfossilized dinosaur skin in Bolivia. It's also been found in Alaska and Nebraska, or in Montana, among some other places. Here's a little close-up of this dinosaur skin. They also found some dinosaur figurines down in the Ica group. Things range from 3 inches to 6 feet long. There was a similar find in Acambaro, Mexico in 1944, over 56,000. Here's an Ica mummy, and on the Ica mummy we've got a piece of textile cloth. You can already see that very well. I'll give you a different view of it. There is what the textile pattern was on the... Here's a piece of pottery from the Ica. Here's an interesting thing on a Cambodian temple. And we're going to blow this up a little bit. Take a look at this. Sure looks like a Stegosaurus to me. This is in natural sketches on the walls of Natural Bridges State Park in Utah. Now, why would people from different parts of the world, different cultures with different backgrounds, draw pictures and carve animals, images of animals they'd never seen? And the question you have to ask yourself, is that reasonable? Is it logical? Is that a conclusion a reasonable man would come to? If you were to see this guy, I think he would make a very deep impression on you. So here's a Viking swallowing a man. Here's a Viking ship. Here's a dinosaur actually embedded on a Roman sword. I'll give you a picture of it. It's real hard to see down here on the lower left, but you can kind of see what we're showing to. Here's a coin from 1609 showing a man slaying a dragon. Here's a coin from 1606 showing a man slaying a dragon. Here's a coin from 1622 of a man. It must have been a pretty popular thing to do in the early 1600s, slay dragons. Here's a Russian medallion. Here's a Bulgarian stamp. The crest of Lithuania. Why would the Chinese have 11 real animals and 1 mythical dragon? Marco Polo wrote in 1871 that's dragons pulled a royal chariot, and in 1611 the emperor pointed out the royal post of royal dragon feeder. I suppose that's because there was a royal dragon to be fed. Evidence of dinosaurs and human beings living together in countries all over the world. Here is what's called the Taylor Trail. We blow it up a little bit. That's human footprints and dinosaurs living side by side, guys. They cut out a stone and stuck it in the American Museum. Here's human tracks inside a dinosaur track. It's a close-up of it. Here's a different print, and they actually took some CAT scans of it to see if it was falsified. Someone cut that in there. And they obviously, you can see the contours around that toe right there to show that it wasn't cut. What are we supposed to do with all this contradictory evidence is the question. What would a reasonable man do? And join the debate that we're discussing here? Well, the evolutionists would say, no way. Evolutionist Isaac Asimov said, creationists are stupid, lying people who ought not to be trusted in any way. All of their points are equally stupid except where the creationists are outright lying. Alexander Bose said, anyone holding the creationist viewpoint must be illogical, backward, subversive, uneducated, and stubborn. I'll give him the stubborn part. One evolutionist said he ought to have the right to fail any student in his class no matter what the grade level indicates, retracting grades if possible, and even possible degrees if a person espouses creationism after passing a course in that. Another guy says, well, grades or degrees of universities who hold special creation concept after having taken science courses should be retracted. In other words, flunk them retroactively. Creationists often complain that their theories and colleagues are discriminated against. Well, as a matter of fact, this guy says creationism should be discriminated against for propagating this propaganda. They should be dismissed. Here's a guy who, when told somebody was dismissed because they were creation, he said, I could not grasp myself that a teacher had so much of a grasp on reality. There is no point in reviewing reasoning on both sides. Creationism is a leftover from a very primitive folklore. Who defines reality, guys? And here's one guy who says, it is the responsibility of professional societies to discriminate against creationists. By separating them from teaching through exposure and removal, it is the responsibility of public school system to do likewise. This is a little bit like the Jews, the European Jews in World War II. First identify them, then separate them, and then what? What's the final solution here, guys? We need to wake up. I fully understand how radical this statement will be that we'll be physically persecuted, but it is an intellectually honest statement, not one to shock. Is this science or outright bigotry? If evolution is true, why all the lies? Why all the need for intentional deception and frauds? How does evolution explain the spirit of man? What within the evolutionary theory would explain man's sense of humor or our ability to love, to create music or art, to compose poetry and write novels? What explains why we need to or have the capacity to understand the inner workings of an atom or the expanse of space?
I trust that this message has challenged you and motivated you to take bold steps of faith to advance the kingdom. We are thankful for the help and support we've received on these recordings from Morris Audio Consulting. Visit them on the web at morrisaudioconsulting.com. We also hope you'll take time to learn more about Noble Warriors and the Iron Sharpens Iron Men's Conference Network by visiting noblewarriors.org. God bless you, friend.